So here we're going to dive a little bit more into Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. This is one of his most famous works, at least in the modern day, even though when it was first published, compared to the book he did on earthworms, the earthworm book not only was he more proud of, but it sold better than this Origin of Species. However, now we're able to realize and look at this, and are diving more into it with a little bit more detail. So what's an interesting point of note of this Origin of Species is that he drafted the preliminary transcript back in 1842. However, he shelved it and didn't really refer to it for 16 years, probably because it was very controversial in nature. However, he talked with Alfred Russel Wallace, and he lived from 1823 to 1913. Independently, he had developed a similar theory. So the correspondence between the two spurred the idea of Darwin to actually bring his theory to publication, and that occurred in 1859. The Origin of Species was disturbing to many because it suggested humans and apes have a common ancestor. So that common ancestor does not mean humans directly derived from apes. It means humans and apes have this common ancestor going back in time. Darwin presented his argument directly in a later book called The Descendant of Man, and this idea spurred a lot of political cartoons, with Darwin typically being portrayed as he looked in his later years with the white beard. You can see here the monkey here. So how did natural selection produce this diversity? How did so many of these different birds derive if there's only one common ancestor? Well, Darwin believed that the Galapagos finches all evolved from this single common ancestor, and he proposed that common ancestor lived in the South American mainland. So here's South America, here's the Galapagos Islands. These new arrivals occupied different niches and were subject to different environmental pressures. So these islands are very diverse. They're in close proximity to one another, but each has got its own unique habitat. As a result, the different food items, the different environmental pressures could lead to development of these many different types of finches, and particularly looking at their bird beaks. So this resulted in a cluster of species. This phenomenon is termed adaptive radiation. So we have like one initial finch, and we have this radius, this radiation that occurs of different variants of bird beaks. The 14 finch species that Darwin studied now occupy 4 types of niches. One was insect feeders, seed feeders, cactus parts and seeds, and the others fed on buds and fruits. So we see here, it kind of does a nice visual representation here. The ground finches are for crushing bills. They are the seed eaters. They can also be classified as the cactus eaters, tough materials to eat. Probing birds, these could be ones for insect feeders, is a portion. Also, those that have grasping bills could live in trees for grasping food items. So this helps explain the large diversity that has occurred. This is an interesting graph here. So we have the number of individuals here on the y-axis, and here we have the depth of their beak. You see here we're measuring. So in 1976, the average beak depth, you could see here, let's say it was around 9.5. However, comparing that, we have a lot of individuals there. Comparing it to 1978, notice the average beak depth increased to just a little over 10. This is millimeters. There's a shift in the average beak depth, due to a drought. So this environment is influencing some of this. The drought will cause the insects potentially to go deeper into soil. And we see here in our dry and wet year how it changes our beak depth in millimeters. So depending on the environmental conditions year to year, based on the food items, that can influence the individual's beak depth. And what we see here is in 1976, a very large population. 1978, a much smaller population, but of that population, the vast majority had a larger beak depth. And that allows them to more efficiently feed on food items. And the Grant's research supported Darwin's hypothesis, so it's supported by not just Darwin, but other scientists. Populations and gene pools, the general concepts, terms you should be familiar with. Population is simply a localized group of interbreeding individuals. The gene pool is a collection of alleles in a population. Remember the difference between alleles and genes. Here's an example of our genes, and here's our alternate alleles. Genes are just the specific DNA sequences. Alleles are referring to the actual phenotype that we see. And the allele frequency is how common that allele is in the population. how many capital A's versus how many lowercase a's in the entire population. So that's allele frequency. Lastly, there's 5 agents for evolutionary change. One's mutations that occur. In this case, UV light is an example. Gene flow, where we have genes being inherited or added, in this case, to a different population. Non-random mating. What this means is we see an individual here, we see 2 males, 1 female. Non-random, this female is selecting for this male that has a showier feathers here. So it's not random. She's specifically selecting for that male, and we see the offspring are going to have traits similar to that one, and that's what's going to be passed on. This other individual sadly is selected against. Then we have genetic drift, where we're seeing a shift, in this case, towards the blue circles here, away from the red circles. So that's genetic drift. And then this whole idea of selection. What, based on the environment, will make one individual blend in better, allowing it to avoid predators, for those genes to be passed on to the following generations.